Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
I guess what I didn't realize is that I could have given a lot more, and by giving, I could have also healed myself. I didn't realize that, and that's something I'm only realizing much more recently, and I'm trying to move in that direction.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 39, where the humidity is too damn high. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or if authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Bill Kelly about his book, It Didn't Come Easy, a spiritual autobiography. Bill Kelly studied philosophy at NYU and UC Berkeley, and then left the United States at the age of 26 for travel and adventure. Unexpectedly, Bill ended up living abroad for almost 25 years, 5 years of which was spent traveling with little money in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Eventually settling in Japan, Bill was active during the 1980s and early 1990s, organizing groups, giving talks, writing, and teaching first English and then intercultural communication. When Bill returned to the United States in 1996, Bill studied for a doctorate in communication studies at the University of New Mexico and taught for 13 years at UCLA before retiring in 2014. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. I'm very excited to be here today with Bill Kelly to talk about his autobiography and his amazing life, and spent the last couple weeks reading through his book. And he is a fascinating person who's lived all over the world and had many interesting things, many interesting experiences to talk through. And so I'm really interested in learning more about his life. So welcome to the podcast, Bill.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and it's always nice to be able to express myself. Hey.
Yeah, I'm just before we get going, I always like to know just a little bit about the sort of genesis. I mean, what made you want to write an autobiography in the first place? And I noticed the subtitle for your autobiography is a spiritual autobiography. What does that part mean?
Well, that's actually how it started, because I was in a class with two people that I knew from the meditation center where I go. And it was like a kind of spiritual class where what you're trying to do is, uncover the forces inside of you that are still hidden, and bring it to consciousness and become whole again. And one way to do that is through talking about, and then writing about and expressing what is going on inside of you, letting it come out. And we learned how to do that in that class, or at least we had practice in doing that. So I enjoyed that process. And then the class ended, and I only gotten up to maybe about my 35th year. And I put it aside for a while because I was having a lot of trouble with my neck and shoulders, and I couldn't do typing and things like that. And then as I was retiring, I was thinking, well, what do I want to do with my time? And I thought, writing seems to be one of the things I really want to do. But writing about what? And I said, oh, there was that autobiography. Maybe I'll take that up again. And when I took it up again, I really wanted to do it. And then I just kept doing it.
Yeah, that's great. We can get on a roll like that. So yeah, let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning of it all, your childhood. I saw the sort of first part when you were talking about your childhood, you wrote that you had, kind of grew up in an environment that was spiritually and emotionally impoverished, which sounds rough. So, what was that like? What was that childhood relationship with your family like?
Well, my mother was basically the ruler of the house. And um, to her, the only things that, at least to me, seemed to matter were money and then acting conventionally. Okay. So there was no warmth or affection. There was no touching. There was no, talking about what's going inside of myself or of not definitely not what's going inside them. Um, so it was very lonely. My father was in the background. He was kind of passive. So I just took refuge in books and reading and when I could, sports. So that was the only way that I could get closer to life or feel alive at all. I mean, it was like somehow a dead environment. At least that's how I perceived it. I mean, it couldn't have been totally like that, but my memory at least tells me that that's what it was.
Right. That's the part that stuck with you
Yes,
in your
yes,
life.
yes.
So yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned sports and reading. Sports really came up many different times, kind of throughout the early part of the book,
Mm.
both in terms of playing and watching and all that stuff. So, what did sports, football, baseball, mean to you early in life, and has that continued? How do
Yeah.
you view them now?
Well, I guess sports really took me away from my mind and helped me to get out of the inner world in which I was like, just totally trapped. And I would have to say it obviously saved me from deep depression, kind of like terminal depression. It
Hmm.
saved me from it. And when I had a breakdown at the age of 18, it was when I could no longer play touch football. It was getting to be winter. And then that like seemed to have precipitated the breakdown. So there it became really obvious that without that outlet, all these pressures that were going on inside of me were just going to consume me, basically. So as I say, it was like when I felt really alive was, and also, I felt a lot of pressure to be a man, right? In the
Hmm.
stereotypical American way of the 1950s and 60s. And this was like seemingly the only way that I could do it was through sports, Otherwise, I was clearly not a man. I didn't
Hmm.
chase after women. I didn't drink and smoke. And, I didn't do all the things that, supposedly made you a man, right?
Hmm. So it was a way that you helped to hold on to your identity.
Yeah, yeah. What little that I had. Yeah.
And how has that changed throughout your life? I mean, do sports still have that important role for you? I'm guessing you're not playing, quite as much football, but
Actually, I go to these exercise classes, which are pretty vigorous.
oh,
And
great.
I feel really good. I feel really alive. It's almost like once again I'm playing touch football, you know.
Hmm.
And I in a stereotypical way too. I feel like a man again, I
Hmm.
mean a little bit. I mean not like I did when I was a kid, but still. And then when I watch the sports, I still like to watch pro basketball, and it's very exciting. I guess I always wanted to be like that.
Hmm.
I never really wanted to be just an intellectual or just whatever I was. It's the part that I never achieved because I just didn't have the abilities, and I didn't have the confidence, whatever else it takes.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I remember I grew up, my dad would take me to Laker games a lot. And so that basketball is kind of the sport that I understand best. So I can watch it and be like, okay, this is why they're doing that, or here's
Mm-hmm.
what's going on.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, I agree. There is maybe a little bit of that idea like, wow, like, I couldn't quite achieve at that level, but I understand and I appreciate and I want
Mhm.
to, watch what these, amazing players can do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's really cool. The other part that you mentioned is reading, and the title of the podcast here, you can guess I'm a huge reader. I absolutely love books, and you talk about books throughout. the book really just all over the place. I mean, I really appreciated all the different individual books you mentioned that you read. You know, I can start adding stuff to my list. Um, and you know, you described early on your love for the books, kind of in your teenage years. It really became a big thing. But you know, later in the book, you know, as you got older, you seemed a bit worried that it was almost like a compulsion, like you were using reading as an escape from everything else. Um, Kind of, how do you feel about that now? Is that how you felt at the beginning, or did you feel like it changed over time? And maybe talk about any of the books that you had read that really influenced you.
Well, obviously, at the beginning, it was just, a way of kind of saving my life. So it was an addiction because it. I don't want to say it relieved some of the pain, but it somehow it was like a tenuous thread that I had to real life. At least I was encountering life in the books, and I was like talking to these people who were the writers, or they were talking to me, you know. So it in that sense it was an escape from life because I couldn't deal with life, but I wasn't aware of that. I mean I was just surviving. I didn't have the ability to really reflect on it that much, and I couldn't have stopped because I didn't have enough else in my life to live. So now obviously it's different. I don't feel like that
Mm.
anymore. And that's when the worries started to come in that, well, am I still trapped a little bit in this compulsion to read, and as a way of not facing reality, not facing what's going on in my life. To some extent, of course, when things get too intense, you do need to be by yourself. You do need to have a little space for yourself. But I was worried, was I really getting the balance right? And I'm still
Hmm.
dealing with that, but I'm getting better at it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think definitely finding that balance is key, and something maybe that even changes throughout our lives. What sort of balance we need,
Yeah, yeah,
so we have to be
yeah,
attuned to that.
yeah.
Were there any books in particular that you felt really impacted you?
Yeah, yeah. Especially when I was younger, I would say three authors were the most important for me. So the first was Nietzsche, and um, he, for me, he affirmed courage. And that you had to love fate. He believed in the eternal return, and that all these terrible things that have happened to you, right, are going to be repeated forever. I mean, this is like a myth, but it it showed his courage that he could actually affirm that. And I said, wow, if I could do that, that would be so incredible, because it's like life is totally negative in some ways, but yet you're affirming it. And in that way, is it becoming then positive? I mean, it's
Hmm.
very interesting for me. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, then there was Cesare Pavese, who was an Italian writer who committed suicide at the age of 42 in 1950. Um, and his diaries were like amazing in their lucidity. He just saw himself with such clarity, and what he saw, of course, were all his weaknesses, and he just stripped away every illusion. So and that I admired. Like, wow, could I do that? And then, of course, he killed himself. That was the end of his diary. So that was a
Hmm.
very astringent sort of model there. And then the other one, and these are all kind of existential writers. The other one was Andre Malraux, who um, to me was so he demonstrated intensity, and his philosophy was to live with intensity. It's the only way that you could give your life meaning was to confront death, to face death, and with in that kind of intense situation, then you were truly alive, and then you could affirm your life. And in the Royal Way, which is it takes place in the jungles of Cambodia, it's like this great adventure and trying to leave a scar on the map on the earth. And that, I think, had a big influence on the kind of travels that I undertook, and what I tried to achieve in my own travels was, in a way, following Malraux, who later, many years later, I found out that a lot of this was actually made up and he was his own myth, uh,
Huh.
which was a shock
Wow.
to me.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, so tying in with some of what you were talking about there in terms of your favorite authors, you talk a lot about your drive to understand different religious
Mm-hmm.
ideologies and worldviews, and how you were really just going through all these different books. You were in constant communication with different people as you were traveling around the world, and you were really trying to figure out, what made sense for you, what worked for you, in terms of understanding yourself and your place in the world. I guess, how did you create a framework or a mental way of understanding and deciding about what worldviews and ideologies were going to work for you?
Well, actually, it was really a question of experience ultimately. So,
Hmm.
in this sense, what happened to me was not that I chose to believe this or that. It's almost like it chose me. I was just thrown into that situation where um, I just felt like, well, this is all I can do. I mean, this was the right thing to do. So, for example, I read Albert Camus when I'm 17, and this is the first author who didn't believe in God, you know, and I'm like shocked. But when I'm reading him, I'm going, he's right. Yeah, I like it just hit me. He's right, and I'd never even imagined such a thing. Yeah, and then when I did psychedelics in Berkeley, I had this mystical experience. So I was an atheist until that moment, and then after that, I was never an atheist. I mean, I had no choice. It just happened. It was so
Mm,
powerful. It was just so overwhelming. It was like, wow, I'd never, like, my eyes just opened suddenly. And then
right.
what would be another example? Yeah, okay. When I was 40, I went to an ashram for the first time. And then on the fourth day that I was there, suddenly in my mind, it was like the light went on. When I was listening to the spiritual teacher, talk, suddenly I understood all the things that she was talking about. I'm going, huh? Whereas before it didn't make any sense to me. I vaguely knew what it was about, but, you know, and I went, oh, this is it. Okay. So, now the difference would be politics. Okay. I have not had that kind of experience, let's say, with politics. And so what I've tried to do is like have a spiritual foundation for my political beliefs and make sure that they're always humane. Yeah. But I also do a lot of reading, and I do a lot of thinking, and I try to understand a lot of things very concretely so that my political positions will will be fair in that sense, as well as humane. But it's not like I
Mm.
had this great experience that told me, oh, this is the correct politics. That never happened.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, you don't often take psychoactive drugs and have a decision about Democratic or Republican leanings. Not so much stuck in the brain.
Right.
That's a really interesting point, though. That it's those sort of moments when our minds are things are suddenly clarified in our mind that drive us.
Or maybe
Um,
our ego suddenly steps back
mm.
and you're open to something deeper than you've been aware of up until then. Mm.
Yeah, no, that's a great point too. I mean, I think we definitely have sort of shields up about what ideas we're willing to let into our mind. So yeah, sometimes when we find ourselves in an experience where we can lower those, maybe that's when new thoughts come in. I think that's one reason that I like traveling so much is that putting yourself in a different environment tends to help you think differently. I've
Oh
found.
yeah, yeah. Very true for
Yeah.
me too. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your friendships and romantic relationships, because that's big parts of the book here talk about all
Ugh.
this. I mean, which is just like real life, right? We have friendships, we have romance. This is who we are. So maybe to start off, Milton and Luciana is sort of a early on discussion that you brought up that seemingly played a pretty big role in how you viewed, intellectual friendships, romantic relationships.
Yeah.
Kind of what happened with the three of you? What's that story? I found it very interesting.
Well, I met them, when I was very isolated and living just in the world of my head and the world of books. And suddenly I meet these older people. I'm 21, Milton's 24, Luciana is 26, and they were the first people who related ideas to real life. I mean, it's like they were doing both. And that just fascinated me. I was just so amazed, and it's like, they understood people, they understood events, they understood life, that they, so I wanted to be like them. I wanted to be around them all the time. I wanted to ask them questions. I wanted to hear what they thought about this and about that. And it was so thrilling. I couldn't believe it. It's the first people I'd ever met like that. And then I fell in love with Luciana, and that went very well for about 6 months. And then suddenly one day she told me that she was going to marry this guy in her office, who was a little older than her, and she wanted to have children. And okay, and that was it. And then suddenly I was just like devastated again. And what attracted me to her, I would say, was that, yeah, she was just so perceptive, had such intuition about life, so sensitive. She was a cultured person, but also had appreciation for, like life's tragedies and the pitfalls, and had gone through a lot, herself. So she was like the ideal woman who could guide me, who could, soothe me, my troubled soul, bring me to life, with her charm and her, how she was so graceful and, caring. And I guess I saw her as warm and soft. But then when she just left me like that, was I deceived? What did I don't know. I still don't know the answer to that one, and then, so that was part of a pattern, I would say, then, that it, coming from the type of person my mother was, and then going through Luciana and any other women that I've liked in my life, I guess I could see a pattern there, that I liked women who were more extroverted, who were more expressive, intuitive, in some way closer to life, and they could lead and guide me back to life, something like that. So they had to be strong and confident too. Although Luciana wasn't like that so much, but the ones later, she was just older. The ones later might not have been older, but they had to be stronger and confident. And it seems like there's a pattern there that has continued until the present day.
Yeah, I think that's a interesting point. Generally, I think we tend to repeat ourselves a lot in friendships and romance, and I always find that interesting. So yeah, that's fascinating to note that seemingly continues. That maybe there's some sort of gap that we're continually trying to fill.
Yeah. But we get better at it, and it's not that it goes away, but we manage it better, and it doesn't hurt us as much. It's not as destructive, at least if the patterns are really negative, like mine were.
Yeah. Okay, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Good to know.
Yes.
So yeah, you just mentioned this briefly, but you did talk about kind of your experience taking drugs, LSD, Berkeley, and there's many other stories sprinkled throughout the book where you're having a good time, and I'm just curious. It's a very interesting thing to think about because you're so open about it. I mean, what role did psychoactive compounds, legal or otherwise, really have on your life?
Oh, I mean, I cannot exaggerate its importance, because, as I said, I was an atheist, and I was so negative and pessimistic about life. I mean, life to me was something meaningless and almost unbearable. Okay. And I was just starting to come out of that. And then on this particular LSD trip, I had this mystical experience, and suddenly I wasn't isolated anymore. I was part of life. I was part of reality of the divine or the meaning, all of that, the nature. I mean, there was no longer separation. So can you imagine? I mean, talk about, blowing a person's mind. I mean, that was like, whoa. Um, and, and to discover through that experience that life is good. I mean, no way. You know, life is positive. Life is meaningful. I mean, how could that be? But after that experience, I had no doubt that it was. So whoa. I mean, and it taught me so many things about the relativity of perception. That what I thought was real turned out to be less real. A kind of a more superficial view of things, and what I experienced turned out to be, at least, that in my experience, it turned out to be something deeper that I had never suspected ever existed. So that taught me that, wow, how you see things is what's key. It's not so much what happens to you, but how you see what is happening, how you experience it. So that's your own filter. It's your own perception that it's all going through. I mean, what an insight that is. I should have, I mean, I was already 24. I mean, I should have already known that, right? But I didn't. So it taught me that, and I'm forever grateful.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very key insight. Knowing that it's almost reminds me a bit about what I know about the Stoic philosophy. The idea that sort of there are things, their dichotomy of control. There are things that we can't control, and there are things that we can control, and we can control a response, but we can't control what happens to us.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's important. Um, so you talk a lot about morals and ethics, and what the right and wrong things to do were. And throughout the book, there's all these different things that happened to you, and you responded to in certain ways. And sometimes you felt very happy with the way that you responded, and sometimes you didn't. You felt maybe a bit ashamed or upset, or
Embarrassed.
and embarrassed. Yeah. So depending on and I think how you feel after you take an action is dependent upon your morals and ethics. Was this right or wrong for me? And it really seemed like that those kind of changed throughout your life, and sometimes that you did things that you were unhappy with, and sometimes bad things happened to you. You got robbed, whatever. I thought, interestingly, like specifically within your discussion on your trip to Africa, you talked about this idea of your moral decline. And so I would just, talk a little bit more about your travels in Africa and what that experience was like, and why you felt like your morals were declining.
Yeah. Actually, the decline really became obvious in Africa, and then it went even further in Asia, in Thailand, and in where else? Indonesia. Yeah. But what was happening was that, I was a believer to a degree in like third world revolution. So I go to Africa, and I'm expecting to see people who, are still in revolt against the West and Western colonialism, which has only been, gone for very few years, right? So I'm expecting it. And instead, what I seem to see is that people are into consumerism. They want to have what the West has. And they're seeing me as a representative of the West. And I'm traveling on almost no money. And I'm trying to live, as simply as possible. So it was, in some ways, a bizarre misunderstanding that I was experiencing. So what happened was I started to enjoy just being an adventurer, doing all this travel, and so instead of caring about the lives of poorer people and people who, the West had messed over, and indirectly I had benefited from all of this, instead of seeing it that way, I just became very self-centered. I mean, only occasionally did I actually do really bad things, but my whole attitude was, now looking back at it, was bad in a way that it was like somehow I was using people so that I could have all these adventures. and that I could experience myself as a real man and as someone who was doing, big things and traveling in Africa, all of that kind of thing. And and I now compare it to the colonial experience, because I think there were a lot of misfits in the metropolitan areas, who then went to the colonies and then felt like they were somebody or they were important. People also played up to me. Oh, you're from America. Wow, and this and that. They wanted to talk to me. I was interesting, different, and stood out, a white face in a sea of black faces, right? Yeah. So I think I was like that. I was like a colonial who went into the colonies and then suddenly felt, not exactly superior, but found himself in not the best way that it could have been done by any means. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that ties in with my next question, which is about identity.
Mm.
It sounds like it's about the identity of you versus the other people there, and a lot of what you were doing throughout your life, it seems like it's searching for that
Yeah.
identity. Who am I? What does this mean to me as a person? And I think that's fascinating. I think that's a journey we all undertake. I mean, do you feel like you've come to any big answers, about your identity? And more broadly, is that something that we can do at all, or is identity sort of something that's always changing? So it's it's something we're always chasing after, but never really going to catch.
Yeah, I do have a fairly clear answer to that one, which is that I do think you can find it, but it still is like it's such a this is paradoxical. It's like almost like an infinite distance you need to travel, and yet at the same time it's inside of you, and it's almost like right there before your inner eyes.
Mm.
Okay, so it's both of those things in a way. So what you can discover, I think, and I think I've done it to just a small degree. Who am I? Is I am the one. I am consciousness. I am, all that is. Okay, that's what I learned. That was the mystical experience that I had, and then I've been in the intervening almost 50 years. I've been trying to find a way to bring that into my consciousness all the time, so that I'm experiencing that all the time. And I have not made great progress. I've made some, and some is definitely better than none in my case.
Mm.
Okay. So on the other hand, though, on the relative plane, where we're not looking at this absolute identity that can be realized through, meditation, whatever, what's happening to me is I'm going through a lot of different phases. Different things are being emphasized at different times. So then it is like it's continually changing. For a while, I'm an intellectual, and then I'm a traveler, and then I'm living in Japan for almost 20 years. I become an organizer, and then I'm a husband and a father, and then I come back to America and I'm a teacher, and then I become a kind of intellectual again. And so to a certain degree, I identify with these roles, but it's interesting. As I'm getting older and as I'm trying to do spiritual practice, I'm identifying less and less with these roles. So that they still, some of them are more prominent than others, and I'm invested in them to a certain degree, but not as much as I once was. So if I lose the identity of, say, teacher, right? I retired, no longer a teacher.
Mm.
Well, now I'm becoming more of a writer. Okay, I can do that. I wasn't that attached to it. Whereas, let's say when I was an intellectual, or when I was very young, I was just so attached to those identities, and I wanted to be proud, and I wanted to achieve something. And if I didn't, it would bring me down. I'd be depressed, and it's not like that anymore. I mean, the level of investment is so much less than it once was, but it's still there. I mean, by no means have I transcended all of this. By no means.
Yeah, you're just maybe able to let things go a little bit more easily
Mm,
if you don't, achieve 100%
mm.
of
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. I think that definitely happens over time, and as you see the kind of life just play out in front of you, that it's not just going to be a string of amazing successes forever. There will be setbacks.
Oh, definitely.
Um, you mentioned you're 20 years in Japan, so let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, Japan played a major role in your life. You spent 20 years there. You married a Japanese woman. You raised a family there. So, what drew you to the country initially, and what was it like? Kind of having a family there, which is an experience very few Americans, I think, would have.
Yeah. What drew me there originally was not much. Just I'd been sick in Southeast Asia, quite sick. I needed a place to recover, and it would be a good idea to make some money too. So I had heard while traveling that there were two choices: Australia or Japan. I first chose Australia, but I couldn't get a long enough visa to actually carry this out. Okay, so then I said, well, let's do Japan then, and I did. Um, and I didn't. I was fascinated by it, but I didn't. But also lots of things I didn't like because it was almost like, in some ways, more American than America in the sense of economic development, science and technology, economic growth above all, monstrously huge cities. And I was living in one of them, Tokyo. It was like, wait a minute, this is almost crazier than being in New York in some ways,
Mm.
And I thought I had left all that behind. Why am I here? What's going on here? Of course, there was also a culture that was very different. So I left, and then I decided, though, ultimately, after I'd done so much traveling and gotten sick again, and all of this, I said, I've got to settle somewhere. Where can I settle? And strangely enough, I thought, I had visited Japan just briefly a few years before, and I actually had a good experience, especially at the end. And I said, I have friends there still. I can, make a living pretty easily, not having to work that much, have a lot of free time, do other things. And Japan is a fascinating country because it's the only country that has become, highly industrialized and at the same time has tried to preserve its traditional culture. So in a sense, isn't this the most interesting place to be and to study? See, so I'm not going to just travel. I get back to study, and okay, I'm going to learn the language, and I'm really going to understand Japan. You see, so all right, that's what brought me back. And then
Mm-hmm.
I had made the decision I was going to give Japan the full shot, and I did. And then living there, well, it was a very comfortable life for me, for my family. Like my children did not face any prejudice, even though they were mixed race. And my wife said maybe when they get older, she thought that they would, but they didn't when they were young. And I was also fitting into what you might call a third culture, which is like there were Western people living in Japan, and then there were Japanese who had spent time in the West and had come back. Okay, and we were like a culture of our own. Yeah, and the people that we couldn't relate to were those who were monocultural. you know, and it was fascinating. I mean, we had so many. There were so many things that could be done within that third culture of bringing the two cultures together and understanding them. And so I was writing and I was organizing groups that were dealing with these kinds of issues. And I just had so many opportunities. It was so fascinating. And for a person who had been so isolated and lonely and had trouble acting and doing in society. I mean, I could do it in the middle of Africa, but could I do it in a modern industrial society? and I found out that I could to a certain degree. So that was wonderful. And maybe the last thing to mention is that my personality in some ways fit in better to Japan because I'm highly introverted, and Japanese tend to be more introverted, and they, they're emotionally sensitive, and they listen. And in America, it was hard for me to compete. I just felt like it was hard to assert myself and to be in this, the so-called rat race and all of that. Whereas in Japan, it's more like people listen to you. People are more reserved. They give you a chance. If you happen to meet you, they accept you as part of that group. And as long as you're in that group, you don't feel that pressure. You feel it's like it's been compared to a lukewarm bath. Whereas for me, America is like, it's cold.
So yeah, and you've kind of alluded to this a little bit in terms of what drew you to Japan and how life was like there versus America. Talk a little bit about the field of intercultural communication, because it's something that you really found important and you worked at and you taught about. I didn't know too much about it, and I think that's something that's pretty interesting. How did you see yourself within that field, and what drew you there, and kind of where do you think it's at now?
Okay, so I would say that the simplest definition, and it's a good starting point, is to say that it's just the study of the cultural differences that affect communication. Okay, and in the 1980s, Japan was becoming an economic superpower. And people, especially in America, were starting to think that the Japanese are going to take over the world. They've taken over, consumer electronics. They're taking over automobiles. They're starting to move into finance. They're buying up our real estate. Like, where is it going to end? America was going to become almost like the third world, or like a boutique or something. Where Japanese would just come. I mean, it still may happen with China, but anyway, in those days it was Japan, right? All right. So there was a lot of tension and conflict, and also just as a person, I mean, living in Japan, the differences really hit you. They really strike you. So how do you navigate this, both at the personal level and at the level of societies and nations? How do you navigate this? So intercultural communication as a field is going to give me some clues. It's going to teach me how I can do this, okay? So that was a great promise, and it was almost like applied anthropology. It's like you can understand, the society that's so different from your own, but then let's get now down to the level of application. How do you actually get along with people from that society? How do you actually communicate effectively with them? The understanding is the foundation, but there needs to be more. You actually have to practice it. You have to do it. So that means getting into the nitty gritty, of the communication. So, and here's the strange thing, I mean, in America, I was probably one of the worst communicators, right? I was just isolated and out of it and lost and all of this and that. You couldn't be more alienated. And then when I'm abroad, and especially in Japan, I'm starting to see that I'm actually good at this. And it's a shock. I can hardly believe it. I'm good at this? Well, because I was less attached to my own culture. I was searching. I was open. I needed to expand. And therefore, those qualities seemed to help me to communicate interculturally. So that became my field then. That's what I wanted to do with my life, because it wasn't philosophy, which was so abstract, although you do live philosophy, of course, but it was something I could actually do in the world and society, and help other people to understand and practice some of the things that I had come to understand and to practice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely key, especially in our day and age. Uh, so you ended up moving yourself and your whole family from Japan to New Mexico, and you picked up a PhD again that you had previously kind of dropped out of it.
Yeah, right. Right.
Why did you decide to come back to America after all that time and restart your PhD and kind of bring your family to a whole new world, essentially?
Actually, I planned to live in Japan the rest of my life, but my wife said, now that our children are getting a little older, um, life is going to get more difficult for them as mixed race uh, people. Uh, and she thought that it would be better if they grew up in America. And she had spent a year in Boston, and she could speak English decently. I was kind of surprised at that she was willing to leave Japan, but she was very devoted to the children and to raising them, and that was her belief. And I said, okay, now what do I do? Oh God, how do I survive in America? I've got to go back there, really? Okay. So, fortunately, through the field of intercultural communication, I knew a professor who had written the first textbook of intercultural communication, and he had spent over 10 years in Japan, and he was now teaching at the University of New Mexico, and they were just starting up a new PhD program in communication studies, but which focused on intercultural communication. And you also had, 10% of New Mexico was Native American people, about 40%, I think, was Latino. Okay, so a perfect place to study, intercultural communication through field work, through getting out into the communities. So I said, "Ooh, this sounds very good." So that's how I'm going to do it. Now, the only thing I needed to complete this was to get money, which I didn't have. So I asked my parents, I said, well, eventually, I will inherit a certain amount of money from you. Could you give me some of that now? And I said, this is the only way I really will be able to come back to America. And they did want to see me, even though we're not close by any means, but they wanted to see me, and they were kind of curious about their grandchildren. So we made a deal. I'd come back and they would pay for it. So it was doable.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm glad that worked out. And then kind of you were in Mexico for a bit and you ended up in LA. And you talked a bit about your life in LA. I mean, what was your family life in LA like? And particularly you talked about obviously the very difficult moment when your wife passed away. What was that like for the rest of the family? What was that? How did that affect the relationship with you and your children while you were in LA teaching?
Okay. See, the difference between New Mexico and, let's say, Southern California was that in New Mexico, there were no Asian people, or almost none. I mean,
Hmm.
and there was no connection with Japan. So my wife felt this keenly. In LA, there was Japanese media. You could watch NHK, just lots of things. There was Japanese food. There were Japanese cultural events. There were Japanese people. There were places schools where you could teach Japanese. Okay, so for my wife, this was all great. Although she eventually realized that the personal relationships in LA were not as warm and as enduring as the ones in New Mexico. Okay. Now, the children did fine in both places, except that my son, Jun, he became very withdrawn when he came to America because my children spoke no English when they came. My daughter was able to handle that without much difficulty, and my son was not. So after that, he became very withdrawn. So that was in New Mexico, but he got along. Okay, the same thing in Southern California. Otherwise, the children did fine. I mean, there were no issues here being mixed race in California, because there are a lot of people like that, you know. Now, my wife, okay, the thing to understand about my wife's passing, though, is that for about maybe 10 years, yeah, the relationship was going downhill. It had been good, reasonably good for the first part, and then it was starting to go bad. Not obviously so at first, and then when my father moved in with us after my mother died, the conflict between my wife and my father was just so bitter and so horrible. Okay, so that drew us apart. So when she died, we had been fairly apart for at least, say, 5 years. Okay, so I was not so emotionally affected by it, although I was definitely saddened by what happened to her, even though we hadn't gotten along. I still, as a human being, I felt for her. Okay. And then suddenly I was in a very different position. Here I am working full time. I've got to take care of the house because she only worked like half a day a week. So suddenly now I had to take care of the house, a big house, which she had done. My wife had always been much closer to the children than I had. Now here, my children are devastated by her death. I have to be emotionally strong for them. Okay. And I have to be able to close this gap between me and them. And so it's not easy. I mean, it was challenging, but I think it was really good for me because I became much more connected to the house, to the outside, and also connected to the children. So that was all good, but it was a big challenge for me. Yeah. Yeah.
And speaking about big challenges, I mean, you definitely started to run into many of them as you continued your life. One thing you talked about was memory loss, and that I think to me there's sort of nothing scarier than not remembering things that either that happened to you in the past or very recently. And you talked about how that affected your ability to work and do some of the things you cared about. What was that like, and how did you come to terms with that? How did you not lose your identity during that process?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was very scary. I'd had a car accident about 15 years ago. And then about 5 years, well, okay, I was unconscious for 2.5 hours. So it was a severe concussion. Right? Then about 5 years ago, it really hit me hard. Whereas before, just maybe once or twice a year, something would happen that would remind me that I'm not all there in the brain, But now it was happening like almost every day. And I'm going like, whoa, what is this? I got really frightened because it seemed like I never knew if I could do what I needed to do. Would I be capable of doing what I had to do? I didn't know. I mean, one of the things was driving. I bumped into a car behind me. Which I knew was there, and then I forgot was there, and I was getting lost suddenly. I almost had a huge traffic accident one time. I couldn't administer my classes anymore. I would put the same questions on the tests, or I was like, oh God, it was horrible. I couldn't trust myself if I would use the gas right. I'd leave the gas on, or I couldn't remember what day of the week it was, so I'd get parking tickets, because, and I wouldn't forget to look at the signs. I couldn't keep appointments. I have to write everything down, and like, oh God, I mean, it was horrible. So then the stress was making it worse, right? Mm-hmm. So what am I going to do? And then the people around me are denying that I had any problem. They're all saying, "Oh, you're just getting old. I have that too. Oh yeah, the same thing happens to me." That was like, oh no. So there was no support, no nobody I could rely on because everybody's denying that there's anything going on with me. Okay, because if we're just talking, they don't see a difference. You see, this is all short-term stuff. I could still remember all kinds of things. That's how I could write my autobiography, obviously. I mean, I used to have a very good memory. Uh, so fortunately, with the spiritual practice, with my philosophy of life, I said, look, hey, I'm going to die anyway. Everything that I have, I'm going to lose anyway. Why am I holding on to this? Why can't I accept this? Don't I believe that I can accept whatever happens to me, the ups and the downs? Okay, now we're doing one of the downs. And I worked on this with myself. And I would say after about 6 months, I could accept it. I could say, okay, I just have to plan now for, do I have enough money, that we can hire care for me, my children ready to be on their own and more. And okay, so I was all prepared and I could accept it. And at that time, then the stress levels started to go down. I was having lots of stomach trouble. I had lost so much weight. I couldn't sleep well. So all of that started to improve to a degree, and I'm also discovering that there are ways to deal with this, even though the doctors tell you that there aren't. I mean, they give you Aricept and they, whatever, but they say, hey, it's going to last for a while and then it's not going to help you that much. And there's really no cure. So you're not going to get better. They just told me, like, it's just a question of how fast you're going to get worse. I go, okay. But fortunately, in the worlds that I travel in, the spiritual alternative medicine worlds, not everybody believes that. So I had a friend who said, she was 4 years older. She said, I'm going through some of the same things. I had a bit of a car accident too, and I'm not even going to go to a doctor. I'm going to do these Ayurvedic herbs. I said, okay, I'll try them. And it seemed to stop things. I mean, it was a combination of not being anxious anymore, not feeling all the stress, accepting it, combination of that and the herbs. And it no longer got worse. And it maybe even got a little bit better in some ways. So some areas got a little better. Maybe some areas like remembering names and things like that got a little worse, which maybe could attribute to age, which is going to happen anyway. But it didn't get worse. And it's been 5 years now. And then I started to do Dr. Bredeson's protocol. He's the author of The End of Alzheimer's, which just came out this past year. Was it last year? Here's where I get vague about, this is part of my memory issue. Like, when was that exactly? When did that book come out? I know, but I don't know. Okay. So I started following that and got off the Ayurvedic herbs and did other herbs because there was a practitioner here in LA that I could work with. Okay. So that's what I've been doing. And it's a lot of lifestyle kinds of things that keep me from getting worse. And so I've come to terms with it. I mean, it's still there. I mean, I still do a lot of these things, but I kind of know how to minimize them. I retired. I didn't have to teach anymore. Okay, I don't ever put myself in a position where I have lots of responsibility, where the mistakes I make can harm or injure other people or mess something up big time. I write so many things down. Yeah, so I can deal with it now. I'm okay.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, me too.
One of the last parts of the book, you mentioned you're returning back to Asia, and obviously you've spent so much of your life there, either traveling or living there. What was that experience like, kind of going back after resettling in the United States?
Oh, it was just wonderful. I mean, it was incredible. I just loved it. So, and just seeing that what was similar and what was different, to what I had known. So, for example, in Bali, in 40 years, I hadn't been to Bali in 40 years. I'd been there twice in the 1970s. I mean, this area in central Bali that I'd once been to, it didn't even have a paved road at the time. And then now it was just like hundreds and thousands of tourists, and the roads are all paved, and there are all these restaurants and shops, and there's so much traffic that you can't even get into the center a lot of the times, and you can't even find a parking space. You know, I mean, it was like, whoa! But at the same time, there were still the ceremonies, and the people were still great, and the aesthetics and the artifacts and uh, the rice terraces. So it was like such a split world, like Japan was in a way. It was almost like maybe that's the way Japan was like 100 years ago. I don't know, you know.
Mm.
So that was amazing. And then Japan. Now Japan did not seem so different. Um, One of the things that really struck me just was now there are just so many Chinese tourists. Well, also in Thailand too, but in Japan, I was like amazed because the main tourists before had been Western people, and now there were more Chinese tourists. Okay, all right, but everything else was similar. So I still like the train systems, the incredibly convenient, amazing, the safety. It still felt so safe. The cleanliness was still like whoa. People's aesthetic sensibilities, they still existed, especially among the older people, which was something I'd always loved in Japan. People's emotional sensitivity still existed among at least the people that I knew, you know. And my friends most of them were still there. Oh, also the way people dressed, especially the women, so tastefully, you know. What didn't I like? The Tokyo crowds, the lack of space, the noise, but otherwise it was, I loved it, and I was almost tempted to go back for a longer time, but I said
Yeah.
no, this doesn't really make sense. But I was thinking about it. I was saying, LA, I don't know that many people. I'm not that tuned into everything that's going on here. Don't I feel more comfortable in Japan? Yeah, in a way, yes. But in practical terms, no, it wasn't a good idea.
Well, it's at least good that you had that experience of going back and reconnecting. I think that's meaningful.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So that's kind of all the questions I came up with. Was there anything in particular that you hope people get out of the book or learn from the book that we haven't touched on yet?
Your life is as you perceive it in a way, right? And therefore, look at your life positively. See things. Yeah, I mean, the simple message, right? But that's what I learned through all of this experience. And the title, of course, is it didn't come easy. So I would hope that it would come easier for other people.
I think that's a great plug for the book. Are you, what are you up to now? Are you working on any of the writing projects, or are you kind of enjoying yourself? What's happening next?
Well, I'm still going through a lot of intense experiences at times. As I mentioned, I haven't gotten to the end of the road by any means. And for writing, what I do is I've been working on an article about my encounters, like with African American writers. It's an attempt to bring out a part of my own unconscious, like as growing up, all these things that I learned about African American people, which are not basically true, and yet they're part of me. They're unconscious in many ways. So through my encounters with African American writers, unfortunately, not as much with African American people, a little bit, but much more with the African American writers, I've been able to uncover a lot of this and become more whole as a person. So I'm writing about that experience with these authors, especially James Baldwin and more recently Ta-Nehisi Coates. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do a quick thunder round, some quick getting to know you questions, and we'll call it a day. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. What's your favorite food or drink?
I like any foods that I myself don't cook because I'm a terrible cook.
Okay, fair enough. Um, so where's your favorite place you've ever been? I know you've traveled a lot, so I'm curious to know the answer. If you even have a favorite.
It's hard because there are a lot of places that I really like, but it maybe the most amazing experience was the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the people, the nature there, the Congo River, um, just the people were just so great, and it was like truly getting away from it all and experiencing something wonderful, and that is such a tragic country at the same time.
Yeah. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
I wish that I could have done more for the world, and that I wasn't so self preoccupied. And I guess what I didn't realize is that I, I could have given a lot more. And by giving, I could have also healed myself. I didn't realize that. And that's something I'm only realizing much more recently. And I'm trying to move in that direction. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. All right. Well, Bill, thank you so much for being on the show. This was great.
Thank you.
The book is It Didn't Come Easy, a spiritual autobiography, and it is available online for you to read. And I will post a link. And I think you should read it because it's absolutely fascinating. Look at Bill's life, and he completely opens up, and nothing is hidden. And I think that's rare in today's day and age. So, Bill, thanks again for being on the
Oh,
show.
thank you so much. It was a great opportunity for expression.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.